About Teresa of Avila, the mysticism in Teresa of Avila, also known as Saint Teresa of Jesus. She is a remarkable figure and perhaps could be considered a reference point from the perspective of Christian mysticism. It's no wonder she was considered a doctor of the Church, because she conveys Christian spirituality in an extremely simple, extremely pure, powerful, and captivating. I think those adjectives would be quite fitting. For what is the work of this? Such a wonderful lady who left such a deep mark on the history of Christianity and, more than that, on the history of universal mysticism. So, let's go. I really enjoy, some of you know my talks on this subject, mystics like Rumi, like Tagore, like Kabir. Mystics from various traditions around the world, but certainly within Christianity, this lady is a touchstone, a reference point that stands up to any other mystic in the world. For me, it's a very beautiful experience to not only give a talk, a short lecture, but also to pay tribute to someone who inspires so much, who inspires me so much, and who brings a state of peace, of spirit, of depth, a call to go deeper. The life of Teresa of Avila is basically that, an invitation for you to enter your inner castle. Well, very simply, her biography. Teresa was born in Avila, Gotham, Redura, which is a place in Avila, in the Kingdom of Castile, in 1515. And she lived until the age of 67. She died on October 4th, 1582, in Salamanca, in Alba de Tormes, Salamanca. A few basic facts about her life, just to place us historically. She lived during the time of the Counter-Reformation. It was a period when the Inquisition was acting very forcefully. All that conflict between the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. She, then, led a very secluded life inside monasteries. Actually, not that secluded, because she went around founding these monasteries all over Spain, but she advocated a kind of spirituality where, instead of turning outward to the problems of the world, a person turns inward and finds the solution, which is always within and above. Therefore, she has a fantastic response to the turbulence of her historical moment. I spoke recently about Saint John of the Cross. He also worked with her on the same mission, was her contemporary, and even served as her confessor for much of the time. And both of them respond. He was even invited to join in the work of reforming the Carmelites, working alongside her, and they are two remarkable figures in such a turbulent historical period. And today, as we live through equally turbulent historical times, it's good to remember that there were people who found a way out that wasn't among any of the options foreseen by their historical moment, nor by ours. A way out that leads inward and upward, as I keep insisting, as I've said before and will say again. So, it's really worth it. Maybe this is the perfect moment to remember someone so special. She was canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV and only became a doctor of the Church in 1970 under Pope Paul VI. So today, she is a doctor of the Church, recognized for her teachings, her depth, and the mystical path she clearly marked out. And with an incredible humility, because given her historical importance, when you read her works, you can't believe that someone could see themselves as so small. Maybe it was exactly because she saw herself as so small that she became so great, so simple, with the pure intention of guiding the nuns in her Carmelite convent, guiding the people around her. In the simplest, most open way, using the words she had, respecting the authority of the learned. In other words, one of Teresa of Avila's trademarks is humility. And, as it says in the biblical tradition, those who humble themselves will be exalted. She doesn't humble herself in the negative sense of the word, but rather she puts herself in the rightful place of someone who, as a person, is very small, just like all of us, but who serves something much greater. And by serving something much greater, as a philosophical saying I really like goes, a man with God is always the majority. Continuing with our story, it's said that her grandfather was a converted Jew. In that historical context, this was called a Therano. We usually refer to them as New Christians. He was said to have been persecuted and imprisoned by the Inquisition on suspicion of secretly practicing Judaism. Her father, at a certain point, buys the title of knight, gains a certain respectability in society, and her mother is a very devout Catholic. From the time Teresa was very little, her mother taught her devotion to the saints, to the doctors of the Church, and to the whole history of Christianity. And from a very young age, she was raised with this very refined Christian education. There's an interesting story that when she was 7 years old, she took her slightly older brother and decided she would run away to face the Moors to try to convert them or die a martyr. And her uncle caught the two of them outside the city walls, making this escape to convert the Moors. In other words, at that age she already had a very special capacity for self-sacrifice. Such a pure child, with a goal that big, that's really interesting. And then, when she was 14, her mother died. And for the first time, her father placed her in an Augustinian convent in Ávila. Then she was struck by a terrible illness. It lasted 3 years, and it is believed to have been malaria. At a certain point, she was even given up on by the doctors of that time. Well, there was no solution, no way out, and she persevered in her faith, in her state of prayer. And it is said that during this time, she had a series of visions. She experienced states of ecstasy, blessings of tears, waking up in tears, as if she had had visions. Divine visions. And it was a very significant moment. It is said that after she got through this phase and regained her health, many people, living in a prejudiced, dark, and fearful time, claimed that what she experienced might have been the devil's inspiration. And she was very fearful. Because of this, it is said that she began to impose martyrdoms and penances on herself, until her confessor tells her to forget about it, that it was nothing diabolical, that it truly was a divine vision. At 21 years old, already recovered, in 1535, she enters the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation. There is some discrepancy in the sources, but this convent had between 150 and 180 nuns. It was a very large group of sisters living there, and there were many daily visits allowed at the convent. There was an area called the parlor, where the nuns spent a lot of time talking among themselves, chatting. This caused Teresa to feel a certain rejection. She expected a more mystical life, a life of more retreat, prayer, and meditation. And at a certain moment, she says that, while praying before a crucifix, she turned to Jesus on that crucifix and asked, "Who put you there?" And Jesus, on the crucifix, she heard a voice that answered, "Thank you. Your conversations in the parlor put me here." And this kind of voice, this perception she has, gives her a shock, where she realizes that, in fact, what her spirituality demanded could not be fulfilled in that way. And there, she begins to dream of what she would later accomplish, which is the reform of the order. The Carmelite order, with the creation of the Order of Discalced Carmelites. At first only for women, and later, with the involvement of John of the Cross, for men as well. So, this is a period that goes from 59 to 61. She begins to have other visions, which are also very significant in her history. It is said that, at a certain moment, around 1559, she had the perception of Christ's presence very close to her, although invisible, although it could not be perceived by the senses. But she sensed his presence. And the other, already in 1561, is the one that most characterizes her, very famous, which was even depicted by the sculptor Bernini. Today, this statue is in Rome. It's when she sees a seraph, an angel, with a golden arrow, who repeatedly pierces her heart with this arrow, which seems to have a glowing, incandescent tip. It has fire at its tip. She says that when he pierced her heart, it was an immense pain, but at the same time also a state of ecstasy, as if it were a communion with the divine, as if it were the transmutation of her human side. It seems that when he pulls out that arrow, it takes much of her insides with it, as if her physical part had been replaced by a metaphysical part, a part of fire that burns in relation to the divine. And this is a vision she describes as having been a moment of ecstasy, very painful, but also, at the same time, deeply fulfilling. This statue is very beautiful and definitely worth seeing. For those who haven't seen it yet, I suggest you look it up and see the image. So, she talks about this phenomenon. I brought it in her own words so you can get to know it. She describes this contact she has with this angel, with this seraphim, and this moment of ecstasy that she experiences. I saw in his hand a long golden spear, and at the tip what seemed to be a small flame. He seemed, to me, to be thrusting it several times into my heart and piercing my insides. When he pulled it back, it seemed to take me with it as well, leaving me in flames with the great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan. And even though it was so overwhelming, the sweetness of this excessive pain made it impossible for me to wish it would end. The soul is now satisfied with nothing less than God. The pain is not physical, but spiritual, although the body has its share in it. It is such a sweet caress of love that now takes place between the soul and God. I pray to God in His goodness to let those who might think I am lying experience it for themselves. In other words, she asks that this opportunity be given to others. I don't know of many in history who have experienced anything similar. What's interesting is that, many times, she points out that these mystical states even have an influence on the body. In fact, the body reacts to the states of the soul, and we'll see later on that this was witnessed by many. The sheer power of that flame burning inside her was enough to cause even physical signs in her own body. Continuing. She talks about greatly admiring the Confessions of Saint Augustine, which is a work I also like a lot. She admired it deeply. Saint Mary Murada. In 1562, she set out for her first Reformed monastery, the convent of Saint Joseph. She always formed very small communities, at first only 13 sisters, at most, and in the largest, 20. Never more than that, or somewhere between those two numbers. Small communities of nuns, of sisters who lived in these little convents, which she kept multiplying everywhere she went, always following a very austere order. A vow of silence, a constant state of prayer and seclusion, and the greatest poverty one could imagine. Very rough, very simple clothing. She abolished the use of shoes. They began to wear only sandals, which is why they are called bediskoust. She abolished the consumption of meat. Only a very frugal, very simple diet was allowed. And she lived there in that extreme poverty, permanently in a state of prayer and meditation, always seeking to delve deeper into the soul, into her own soul, to find within it God Himself. That was her proposal, and she was exemplary in what she proposed. A state of mass and permanent prayer, always very deep. Well, in 1572, just to briefly summarize the story, I picked out a few points because my intention is to spend more time with you all on some of her phrases, which are beautiful, rather than on her biography, which is very easy to find. In 1572, conflicts began to intensify between the Discalced Carmelites and the original Carmelite order. This would cause a series of unpleasant situations. For those who watched my lecture on St. John of the Cross, you know that he was even imprisoned, spending 9 months in jail, suffering various kinds of torture, and she was forced to remain in absolute seclusion inside one of her convents. She chose exactly the one dedicated to St. Joseph, the first one, and there she stayed in seclusion, constantly sending letters to King Philip II of Spain. Until, after a few years, in 1579, in fact, the Pope himself, Pope Gregory XIII, separates the old Carmelite order from the Reformed Carmelite order, that is, the Order of Discalced Carmelites. And then the persecutions stop, a new order begins, and she gains more freedom to carry out her work, which she will do until her very last breath. You know that at some point, when she was 52 years old, she met St. John of the Cross, who was 25 at the time. He was preparing to join the Carthusians for the same reason as her, seeking a more austere life. She invited him to join her in founding the male branch of the Discalced Carmelites. He answered this call and accompanied her, carrying out his work until the end of his life. Altogether, it is said that she founded 17 convents, 16 of which she personally established, while 15 male convents were founded. So, we have about 32 convents founded during her lifetime, both for women and men, with the support of John of the Cross. An incredible achievement, especially when you consider the conditions she lived in, often traveling alone. On foot, covering very long distances, doing her work, spreading her message, and establishing her communities, her small convents everywhere. And this continued to spread even after her death. Well, now we're finally getting to what I consider the main point of this talk, which is to discuss a bit about her method for the soul's ascent. Here are the 4 stages of the soul's ascent. And then we'll talk about the 7 dwellings from the book The Interior Castle, which is considered her masterpiece, where she describes a bit of this ecstasy, this ability for the soul to deeply merge with God. Well, for her, the 4 stages begin with what's called mental prayer, which is a state of contemplation and concentration on the idea of the divine, even if you can't manage to stop your thoughts. When she talks about this, she says there's no point in getting anxious, trying to stop your thoughts before you start praying, because that's impossible without God's help. Therefore, a person should begin and treat their thoughts as background noise, but start the process of spending as much time as possible in a state of prayer. In other words, it's a mental focus on devotion, on the inclination of the devout person to turn toward God. Of course, I'm a philosopher. I'm not advocating for any particular religious tendency. I'm just talking about someone I deeply admire. So, this reminds me of several other traditions. If you look, for example, within Sufism, which is the heart of Islam, they had something called dhikr, which was a state of perpetual prayer, where they said that only this state of prayer can banish the coarser things from within a person. It can keep them at bay. It really reminds me of that biblical passage about praying and keeping watch at all times. A state of mental prayer. This is the first stage of the soul's ascent that she proposes. The second is what's called the prayer of silence. In this stage, the person begins to experience a state of stillness, of silence, of peace. which even allows for a prior concentration, making way for a deeper prayer. It's the moment when a person steps away a bit from the noise of the world. And even though thoughts don't stop, there's a shift between the thoughts, what she called imagination, and the state of silence, of serenity, which, as if cleaning the temple, prepares the conditions for a deeper prayer. It creates a threshold between the world and the temple, the inner temple, so that a person can truly place themselves before something sacred. Once this boundary is crossed, which is the prayer of silence, comes the third stage, which is the devotion of union. This is a kind of ecstasy where the person already feels absorbed by God, but still retains imagination, in other words, thought. Imagination was the way she referred to thought, and memory. In other words, you feel very close to the divine, but you still retain those elements that make you a separate being. If you still have memory and thought, if you still remember personal things, then you are close to this breath, this warmth of the divine. But you still have a tether to personal things from the past, so the fusion is not complete. And finally, there comes what is called the devotion of ecstasy or rapture. At this point, there is no more memory, no more thought, imagination, nothing at all. A person feels all their functions. In a certain moment, she says that when she is in rapture, she can't even tell if she's breathing. All functions are suspended, and the person feels one with God. At that point, he feels there is no more separateness. You'll see that in various traditions, it's said that this is one of the highest, let's say, elevations that human consciousness can reach. There is a certain moment when a person says, God is there and I am here. In a second moment, you say, God is there and also within me, also here. And a third moment is when there is no longer a there or a here. God and man are one. This search for unity, this fusion, which is spoken of in so many different traditions. This fusion, where everything is immersed in unity. So, it is even said that in this state of ecstasy, of rapture, many times she, in her chapel, praying, when she reached this stage, would begin to levitate. She was seen by several nuns, by various people of that time. It seems that, in a certain way, she infused her own body with the lightness of the soul. Her very body took part in this celebration of the soul. And it seems she lost her weight, her attachment to matter. The pull toward another point of support above was so strong that even her body obeyed this call. This inverted gravity that pulled her upward. It is said that she would enter a state of levitation. This is something that is also said to have happened, for example, with Saint Francis of Assisi. There is an episode that I find very interesting, because at that time, in fact, many things from that era still exist to this day. It was customary to tell the sisters of her order that it was dangerous for them to pray, that they had to repeat certain prayers established by the creed. Mechanically, always just that one and no other. And one of the things she says is precisely to have a prayer that isn't repetitive and mechanical, but where the soul is fully awake, devoted, and in contact with the divine. In other words, this spontaneous prayer that comes from the heart is the moment of greatest authenticity and spontaneity for a person. At a certain point, she says, if someone tells you that prayer is dangerous, consider that person the real danger and run away from them. Notice that she doesn't lack a certain boldness, which might even be a bit much for our times, let alone for that era. If someone says that your intimate and deep dialogue with God is sinful and dangerous, run away from that person. They are the dangerous one. In other words, it definitely takes a certain boldness. This is what led her, at certain times, to be rejected and persecuted by some people. Well, the book I chose to share some thoughts with you is The Interior Castle, or the mansions, where she represents the human soul as a dwelling, a castle with many rooms. And as a person goes deeper within themselves, drawing closer to the center, to their own heart, they also draw nearer to the throne where the sovereign lives, where God Himself lives. They approach that final union, where one is in the world, without being of the world. They are in service. They are a channel in service of the divine. So, it's very interesting. There are beautiful passages. It was written in 1577, from June to November of that year. And you'll notice an immense humility. All the time, she says there are others more learned than she is. She asks God for forgiveness if she is making any mistakes, asks Him to inspire her about what she should say, but she goes on positively adding her own observations throughout her process of inner experience, of delving into her inner castle. It's about how to bring a person, human consciousness, to a mystical level where it feels itself. A terminal in service of unity itself, in service of God Himself. So I brought this book, which is considered her masterpiece. Some excerpts. It's the kind of book that's extremely hard to pick pieces from, because it has, at least my edition, 123 pages. And it's hard to find a chapter that doesn't have some very simple sentence. All the sentences are very simple, all within the Christian vocabulary of the time. But they're deeply imbued with a very elevated mysticism. From that fire the angel ignited her heart. You can still feel that fire today. More than 500 years later, you can still feel that fire. It's there, in every sentence. Honesty is fully present. She is pure surrender and pure honesty. And it's vertical, it's luminous. You can still feel that warmth, half a millennium later. And that's very interesting and very powerful. Well, so the book, as I already mentioned to you, deals with the 7 passages. We're going to talk about some sentences, not in order and not very connected, just some phrases I collected while reading, just so we can get a general idea. We can't talk about all 7 passages, because we'd need, 3 hours or more. We'd need a full commentary reading of this book to cover everything. But, as I mentioned to you, she presents it in a very interesting way, because it's like a room, a circle with several concentric circles. In other words, you're not leaving one room and entering another. You enter the outermost layer and go deeper and deeper toward the center, which is where the throne of His Majesty resides, the throne of God. In other words, it's a search for the center, very similar to what I've been telling you all along. The doctrine of the center, the search for the center, it is unanimously adopted by traditions from all corners of the world and throughout history. The idea of the center, of the spiritual heart of man, which is one with the heart of God and heart of all things. This deep communication, this profound kinship that exists between hearts. So, she brings up things that, as a philosopher, I can't help but compare to the most beautiful mystical moments from all the traditions I've known. This gives us the sense that a person who grows along any path, guided by this deep search for truth, will find their own heart and move toward unity. What matters more is the search itself, the spirit with which one undertakes this search, rather than, strictly speaking, which path one takes. And if we could understand it this way, we would probably recognize and respect all paths, as long as they reach the same destination. Well, then, now getting into the book itself. Let's first put together a small collection before we get into the passages from the book about the dwellings. Let me explain to you a little, basically, what these 7 dwellings are. The first dwelling is the gateway to entering spiritual life. The first dwelling, its main idea is decision. It is guided by your decision to seek God. Above all else, beyond anything, to understand Him more and more and to have Him as the goal of your life. To walk toward the sacred, the divine, toward unity for those who don't quite accept the idea of God. To walk in that direction and to have that as a firm decision in such a way that there are no doubts, no unresolved issues, no other possibilities for your life. If you don't follow a path that, step by step, brings you closer to the idea of the divine. So, this is the first portal, which is the portal of entry into spiritual life, which is based on decision. The second portal, which is the second dwelling, will be the one of detachment, of purifying our relationship with the world. In other words, we have a poor relationship with the world because we are all burdened with desires, wanting to possess things, and the struggle for things, which can be material things, but can also be things from the psychological realm, like reputation, for example. Thank you. Image, recognition, position in a hierarchy, all of these are things. As long as there is desire for things, people struggle with each other, seeking them, because these things are scarce compared to those who desire them. So, this makes our relationship with the world a conflicted one. Therefore, this is the second dwelling, which concerns detachment, the purification of our relationship with the world. It's quite interesting if you look at the Four Noble Truths of the Buddhist Dhammapada. It talks exactly about overcoming Tanyen, the thirst for sensual pleasures, the desires for things that can only be possessed in the material world, which, in reality, we don't actually possess anything, because nothing that is truly yours can be taken from you, and all the things of the world can and will be taken from us, including, as we saw in St. John of the Cross, they cyclically pass through us and fade away. Because in the world, everything is made up of these cycles. The heat comes and cools, life comes and cools, flowers come and fade away. Therefore, these things follow temporal cycles. Nothing is permanent. So, this second dwelling refers to detachment. She talks a lot about this virtue in the book. It's very beautiful. The third dwelling is connected to clarifying our relationship with ourselves. This is a really interesting thing. From the moment I understand that I am not a personality that came to assert itself in the world. I did not come into the world to make a name for myself, but to be a channel for something much greater than me. I came to lend my voice so that a message, which is in what Plato would call the realm of ideas or the spiritual plane, can reach the world through me. That hollow bamboo tube spoken of in Taoism. In other words, to affirm that my deepest identity is to be a voice in service of the great truths of the universe, of the voice of the divine, so that it can reach the world. Therefore, self-acceptance means recognizing your most legitimate identity in unity, in the whole, in the voice of God. In other words, it's another kind of detachment, which is to let go of the need to assert your own name, the need to project your name. That is, it's about clarifying our relationship with ourselves, which I would sum up as becoming a channel. The fourth dwelling deepens our relationship with God. It brings about in us a very profound sense of peace. As you draw closer to what is lasting, you move away from what is not, from what passes. What makes us anxious is exactly this passing, this transience of things. By distancing ourselves from what is temporary and drawing closer to something that is certain, definitive, eternal, we gain more and more support for our consciousness, a state of peace. She never actually uses the word consciousness. She talks about the soul, but it's something very similar within a philosophical concept. So, this gives us a sense of security, where we develop trust, humility, and gratitude. Humility grows with each new dwelling, but here it already needs to be deeply rooted as an essential virtue. So, to understand that only by drawing close to what does not waver, to that ground that does not shake beneath our feet, do we find true serenity, true peace. And achieving this serenity and peace is a result of the fourth dwelling. Entering the fifth dwelling marks a transition. This is really interesting, folks. I can't help but mention to you that those who are familiar with the Indian structure of the constitution of man, that man has 7 vehicles, what they call the septenary constitution. And I can't help but notice that each of these dwellings really reminds me of mastering and overcoming each of the human vehicles. Especially because of what she says here, since entering the fifth dwelling is a transition. It's as if you were moving from one world to another. It's the hardest of all. And in India, that's exactly how it is. It's the passage from the quaternary to the triad, where you go from a denser world to a subtler, more spiritual one. Therefore, it's the most complex transition of all. And she goes on to say that, in this fifth dwelling, our life is no longer just a path toward God. But we experience God living within us. We're no longer just walking. For Him, He is already here more and more. It's about opening ourselves so that this presence of God can guide the course of our lives. It transmutes everything that is not God, and we become a pure channel. So, the fifth dwelling is such a moment. We could say it's a moment of transition and a moment of fusion, a fusion that will continue through the next 2 dwellings. There is still something personal left, but more and more, a fusion takes place, like that fire in the heart that consumes everything that is not God. In other words, it's a transition to a much subtler level of consciousness, a much deeper level of mysticism, a profound dive into the human heart to the point of touching the heart of God. The holy dwelling consists of spiritual commitments. It is an even deeper surrender. You'll see that she talks a lot about the expansion of the heart. Later on, we'll talk about this, where she gives the example of a water tank through which a spring flows. And this spring keeps widening the opening of that tank more and more. The presence of the divine in our hearts keeps expanding that heart more and more, widening that passage, so that all the messages that need to reach the world through us can pass, and at the same time, as our heart is widened, our capacity to love also expands, and more can fit inside that heart. And it becomes more and more able to embrace the whole world, which is its ultimate goal. We'll talk about this soon when we get to the 7th dwelling. So, we can say that the 6th dwelling is the dwelling of a deeper surrender. And the 7th, finally, is the culminating point that she calls spiritual marriage. In this spiritual marriage, a person is united so deeply with God that their only cause, only motivation, only pursuit is God's motivation, which is a profound participation in God's desire to save everyone. In other words, your heart can't contain just the presence of the divine, which is already a lot, but it also holds all the motivations of the divine. That is, your heart embraces all of humanity, and the cause of rescuing all of humanity from pain and suffering becomes your cause too, because if it belongs to God, it belongs to you as well. Therefore, the 7th dwelling is exactly that, making God's cause your own, taking on God's mission as your own, to rescue all of humanity from pain. It's also very similar to the Buddhist tradition, which talks about exactly this. Continuing on, now, yes, let's move on to the quotes. As I said, I picked out small excerpts that I found interesting. Maybe not even the best ones. Of course, I had to make a very tough selection, given the time we have, which, by the way, is already quite advanced. But I hope they're enough for you to get the idea. It seems like the realm of mysticism is a universal territory for pure hearts who draw near to the sacred. There are connections with all the pure hearts of humanity who have also sought to approach the sacred. It seems like there's a certainty there, and that's exactly what she was searching for, a certainty that there is a cause within and above that is necessary. To seek it out when the world becomes polarized. And this is the only cause that justifies the existence of man, and that gives his presence in the world some meaning. A woman, in a time when there was no kind of advertising or media or whatever else, who is able, without wanting anything for herself, to make her name endure for more than 5 centuries, still bringing the peace she possessed to people so long after. It's impressive how powerful that is. It seems like something fragile, a quest that's almost an escape, but it's actually the most powerful of all quests, to transform oneself, starting from within, to transform the world by diving into oneself and seeking not to go to one side or the other, but above. And now we're going to look at some of these quotes. I hope you enjoy them. It's no small pity and confusion that, through our own fault, we don't understand ourselves, nor do we know who we are. Wouldn't it be a great ignorance, my daughters, if someone were asked who they were and they didn't know themselves? Or didn't know who their father was, or their mother, or where they came from? Because if that would be a great foolishness, it's nothing compared to how much greater it is when we don't try to find out what we are and only focus on these bodies. And so, only by force. We know we have a soul because we've heard it and because faith tells us so. In other words, I only know I have a soul because someone told me, because I have no sense of it myself. I'm completely lost in the world, so that if someone were to ask you who you are, what would you say to that person? You wouldn't have a deep and true answer. To go through life as a stranger even to yourself, which is something I often talk about in my lectures, the practice of inner life, of conquering your own identity. How strange it is that someone could spend their whole life like that. And everything they know about the great human virtues is just a repetition of what others have said, without any reflection coming from within. No personal achievement at all. No personal construction of these feelings, or of these human possibilities. They are called the latent powers of man, not bringing any of them to the surface, but just copying from those who have done it, or from those who haven't even done it themselves, but who are also just copying and copying from many others. And maybe all of this is just one big copy. No one really knows what the original is. Just passing it along. There are souls so sick and so accustomed to external things that there is no remedy. It doesn't even seem like they can enter within themselves. Because they're so used to always dealing with the parasites and creatures that surround the castle, they've almost become like them. And even though their nature is so rich and they could converse with none other than God, there is no remedy. Difficult, difficult, Saint Teresa. That really isn't easy. To tell people to go in, to reflect on themselves, not to stay at the doors of their own castle. To know themselves, to know the heritage that was reserved for the human condition. To find their own identity, their inner name. To dive into that mystery, which is your inner name. And not to feel any curiosity, not even to knock on the door, not even to brush against the doorknob. Nothing, nothing, nothing. To stay so much on the periphery that, as she says, you identify with all the alienations that live there, and you die a stranger to yourself. How relevant that is today. And for how much longer will it still be relevant? For how many centuries? For how many millennia? It depends a lot on each one of us. Don't think of imagining these dwellings one after another, as if they were something lined up. But set your eyes on the center, which is the house or palace where the king resides, and think of it like a heart of palm, because to get to the part you can eat, there are many layers covering everything that is tasty. For those who know a bit about Eastern mysticism, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda's master, uses an identical example, except he talks about the layers of an onion. You keep going deeper and deeper, and when you reach the center, you find an emptiness, empty of matter, but full of spirit. This same idea of concentric circles, of diving through the circumstances of life, through learning and diving in until you find that spiritual center, that deep identity, which is where the thread passes through the Hindu Sutratma, which is the essence of all things, which is one and the same. So many voices trying to make us understand this. In other words, once again, here, the interior castle of Mother Teresa reflects the symbolism of the center. Because, although this is the first dwelling, it is very rich and of such great value, and if one escapes the parasites that are there, one will not fail to move forward. In other words, it's very interesting that she says, the first room, that first entrance you make, you already start to feel something of a greater sense of life, but there are still parasites there, those elements trying to alienate you. If you look at a Tibetan text, the Book of Golden Precepts, depicted in the voice of the silence, the first room is the room of learning. And it is said that there are beautiful flowers there, but on the stem of each one of them, there is a serpent coiled around. In other words, it's the same thing that's here, the parasites that are present. So, be careful, because when you start to go deeper into some level of inner life, it can be dangerous. Spiritual pride and vanity are said to be the worst of all. There are still many dangerous things, and you can get stuck there, and not go beyond this first dwelling. Peace, my sisters, said the Lord. And he warned his apostles about this so many times. For believe me, if we do not have it and do not seek it in our own house, we will not find it in the house of strangers. Let this war end now. I ask those who have not yet begun to look within themselves, and those who have already started, that nothing should be enough to make them turn back. The first thing, peace. Dive into your own house and find peace there, so that you don't enter someone else's house and find conflict. Because if you haven't made peace in your own house, you become a source of conflict in someone else's house. In other words, let this war end now. I ask those who have not begun to look within, and those who have already started, not to turn back, to find a way out, where it becomes clear that only this deep state of serenity, of autonomy of man in relation to the circumstances of the world, can make him a spreader of peace, can make him someone who, in the midst of duality, sees the bright side and helps that bright side grow. Which is for the present, which is for the beautiful. Harmony, putting your house in order, is the first condition for being able to move forward, also in various other traditions. To think that we are going to enter heaven, and not enter into ourselves, getting to know ourselves and considering our own misery and what we owe to God, and asking Him for mercy many times, is foolishness. If you're going to enter heaven with your conscience on edge, without knowing anything about yourself, how is that? Where do you think this heaven is? Is it somewhere outside or inside? Even back then, in such a tumultuous, dogmatic time, someone comes along and says, wanting to enter heaven without entering into yourself is foolishness. Think about how profound that is. To penetrate this deeper essence of the human being, which makes him a spark of God, which makes him a promoter of order, harmony, beauty, and goodness in the world. And that is heaven, and not in any other place that someone else or any other place could be. to seek an external heaven without finding an internal one. Foolishness. I don't even know what I was saying anymore because I got really distracted, and when I remember myself, sometimes my wings break when I try to say something good, so I'll leave it at that for now. This is the passage where she starts talking about some things and loses her train of thought a bit. And she says, I thought too much about myself, and now I've lost the thread of the dwelling to talk about God, which is very interesting. It really reminds me of that phrase I've mentioned to you so many times from Helena Blavatsky. She says, when I remember myself, I forget the master. When I forget myself, I remember the master. When we get too caught up in the little details of our personality, its minor discomforts, its little hang-ups, we start to distance ourselves from the whole. We start to distance ourselves from the bigger picture, getting stuck on an irrelevant detail. I don't know if any of you have had this experience. I am a bit of a poet in training, really just a beginner. But sometimes, in the modesty of my situation, I feel that when I try to write something, when some inspiration comes, I can't do anything because I don't feel clean enough to do it at that moment. As Stephen Pressfield says, you have to sweep the doormat so that when the muses step on it, they don't dirty their robes. In other words, sometimes I don't feel clean enough to write a poem. And sometimes that's it, when we want to deal with very lofty, very universal themes. Sometimes we realize that the little things about our personality have taken up so much of our attention that they've dirtied the doormat. And you just can't step there anymore without soiling the garments of the sacred. It's very beautiful. There are so many little things I picked out because they reminded me of 1,000 others. A universal voice of being seeking the divine. Helena Blavatsky has a concept called dynamic eternity. She says there must be intelligent life everywhere. And that we can't know what these voices are saying, can't understand how they express themselves, but we do know what the message is. In every corner, there's a call, calling the children back home, calling beings back to unity. That's more or less what you notice when you see so many mystical, profound beings saying similar things. There are two benefits to this. The first one, it's clear that something white looks much whiter next to something dark. And, conversely, the dark thing next to the white one. The second is that our understanding and our will become nobler and more inclined toward all that is good. When, in turning inward, they deal with God. I took this excerpt, which is a bit out of context. She was giving examples of two benefits you get from reflection, from meditation. First of all, what she's about to say is nothing more than the Eastern theory of impact. That consciousness is born from contrast. In other words, we can perceive white much better next to dark, and dark next to white. In other words, contrast gives rise to consciousness. Between two circumstances, we can perceive the value of each one more deeply. That's why, every now and then, it's important to call on death as a counselor, so we can know the value of life, so we can understand the meaning of life. And the other thing she's going to say is that when you're dealing with the simple things in life, turning inward to yourself, don't forget to place yourself before God. It's a merchant selling his fruit before God. It's a man doing his small job before God. It's a father or mother raising a child before God. In other words, in the presence of the sacred. We can't let ourselves become trivial. The Greeks used to say that we either make life sacred or we trivialize it. The presence of the sacred rescues our lives from triviality. This idea is also very traditional and very beautiful. Another passage. In a big way, it's helpful to deal with those who already know the world so we can get to know ourselves. Sorry, let me reread that. In a big way, It's helpful to deal with those who already know the world so we can get to know ourselves. And because some things that seem impossible to us, when we see how possible they are for others, and the ease with which they handle them, it really encourages us. And it seems that, with their flight, we dare to fly too, just like the chicks do when their parents teach them. Even if they don't fly far at first, little by little they imitate their parents. This is really helpful. I know it is. Did you notice that? Dealing with those who already know the world, who already know the way. In other words, having mentors, those who already know how to fly a little, and we're just learning to take our first little jumps out of the nest. Learning from those who are a little ahead of us. Plato's Academy, where we look up to the lives of heroes who show us how great we can become. In other words, the greatest benefit is doing what Newton advocated, looking to the future while standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, listening to the advice of those who have lived, and lived well, learning from those who already know how to fly when we're just starting to stretch our wings. This is the foundation of so many traditions, passing knowledge from little masters to little disciples until they become great. Passing on knowledge. Because living is more complicated than any technique, and all the techniques, we learn them. But what about living? We think we already know. Those who are still close to the first dwellings can easily return to them because their strength is not built on solid ground, unlike those who are already used to suffering. These people know the storms of the world and how. They have little to fear or to desire from their comforts. And it would be possible, with a great persecution, for them to return to those comforts again. In other words, those who are close to the higher dwellings, when the storms of the world come, they don't get lost in the middle of the turmoil. They know how to find their way back because they've already reached a very high level. Those who are in the more peripheral layers run the risk of falling when faced with turbulence because they are still afraid. And by being afraid, it allows their reality, which was just an illusion, to affect them. They give reality to the fears of the world, to worldly things, by believing in them. Therefore, they are quickly shaken by the things of the world. That's why, according to Saint Teresa, it's wise to seek advice from those who have already approached the first dwellings, the most intimate ones, those closest to the center. These people are no longer deceived, and the storms of the world no longer frighten them. Professor Michel Echenique, who brought New Acropolis to Brazil, had a saying that I found very simple and very interesting. He used to say, "If it rains, run home." But for that, you first have to make sure that you've actually built a house that's sheltered from the rain. This dwelling, this inner dwelling. And when the world becomes turbulent, you have somewhere to take shelter, and you don't let yourself get swept away by a storm, which, deep down, only sweeps away what is superficial. Nothing that isn't eternal can come to meet you, as it says in the light on the path. I just want you to be aware that, to truly benefit on this path and ascend to the dwellings we desire, it's not about thinking a lot, but about loving a lot. And so, whatever most awakens love in you, that is what you should do. What most awakens love in you. In other words, that which most stirs in you the sense of mission, of fulfilling the mission that was given to us by the divine itself. That is, our guidance for which direction to take is wherever our heart is needed. And it is much more a matter of feeling than of understanding. She will constantly, at other times, talk about exactly this. About the discussion between thought, or imagination, and understanding. Understanding is sometimes guided more by the heart than by thought, and they don't always go in the same direction. She realizes this, and she will say that she confirmed it with her own, with more learned men, with her confessors, and she found that this is how life is. I've been caught up in this mess of thoughts, quite tightly, several times. And it's been a little over 4 years since I came to understand, through experience, that thought or imagination is not the same as understanding. I asked a learned man about it, and he said that was indeed the case, which was, for me, a great relief. Because, since understanding is one of the faculties of the soul, it was hard for me to accept that it could be so fickle at times, since usually thought flies so quickly that only God can bind it when He does, in such a way that it feels as if we are, in some sense, detached from this body. In other words, he says, understanding is a virtue. It cannot be made into a plaything. Thought is so fickle that only God can bind it there in the seventh dwelling. Isn't that right? Until then, it still wanders. Obviously, a virtue like understanding could not be identified with thought. If thought expands and creates repertoire, understanding deepens and creates verticality. Deep inner life, identity, the ability to think for oneself, the ability to feel for oneself, the ability to turn the tables in life, which is not about taking, but about giving, not about possessing, but about surrendering. Understanding does a person grasp the true law of life. O Lord, take into account how much we go through on this path for lack of knowledge. And the problem is that, since we don't think it's necessary to know more than to speak our minds, we don't even know how to ask those who know, nor do we understand what we should be asking. And so we go through terrible hardships because we don't understand each other. And what isn't bad, but actually good, we end up thinking is a great fault. That's really interesting, what she's about to say. Just imagine what she's talking about there. How much we suffer for lack of knowledge. Because we think we don't need to know more than just to think of you. She talks about exercising the human capacity for knowledge so that we can find the paths that lead to God. So that we won't be convinced that good is evil and vice versa. This was very common in her time, the idea that someone who thinks, seeks, and searches for a path, who acquires knowledge, is acting against God's will, that this would be something demonic. God's will would simply be to fixate on His name. But if there's no understanding of what that name means, it creates a static distance, where the name stays over there, and ours remains alive here. Only knowledge can lead us to realize that there aren't two names, there's only one. She says, look, forgive us for our ignorance and for not even knowing that we need to know. How common that is nowadays. We don't even value deep knowledge. What we value today is the accumulation of information, not depth. Not the depth that's based on values, on identity, on elevating consciousness. That's not considered something for your resume. What counts for a resume is breadth, repertoire, as they say, the amount of things you've accumulated superficially, which is easily lost. Moving on. Because it seems that, as soon as we start to produce that heavenly water from this spring I speak of, from the depths within ourselves, it feels as if our whole inner being expands and widens, generating blessings that can't be described. Not even the soul itself can understand what is happening there, what is being given. You feel an inner fragrance, let's say, as if it were coming from that depth. And here she gives the example of two tanks, where she talks about one tank that fills with water brought in through a series of pipes, of aqueducts, coming from far away to bring the water there. This would be the accumulation that comes from merely adding up thoughts and information. and the other is a tank that is connected directly to the source. In this pipe, the water is much cleaner, and it comes with such force, it expands with such strength, that it widens the mouth of this tank, so much so that it not only fills up, it overflows. It has water for itself and for everything around it. She says that this mystical, profound knowledge, coming from the contact of consciousness with being, from the contact of consciousness with the divine, using my own words, is like this. The second tank. It has water for itself and overflows to everything around it, and it is pure. Whereas the other has a twisted water, brought from very far away and very limited. Therefore, even if this information comes from reliable sources, it travels so much when it does not come from the pure heart of man that it already arrives a bit murky and limited. That which comes from the very heart of man arrives abundant, overflows, and is pure. It's very interesting. It really reminded me of Pedro. And also of Plato's Ion, when he talks about poetry, saying that no poet, no matter how technical he is, can be equal to a madman inspired by the muses, a madman inspired by the divine. It's more or less the same image. That which is inspired by the divine overflows. It's beautiful, just like he spoke of Homer. And that which is channeled through fashion, through styles, through the way everyone likes things, ends up being something limited and twisted. It's not abundant, it's not clear, and it doesn't overflow. Nowadays, we rarely see what the Buddhist Dhammapada says, a word that brings comfort to those who hear it. In poems, considering that poems were once sacred, used to portray the sacred texts of various traditions, like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Like the Iliad and the Odyssey themselves, like the Epic of Gezer, like Ferdowsi's Book of Kings, so many, many, many others, like the Aeneid. The poem was something sacred, that is, it expressed the sacred word. Continuing. Well, here I brought a quote from Rumi for you, because I just couldn't resist. It's such a beautiful passage, so beautiful, that it reminded me of Rumi. There's a passage from Rumi where he says the following: I came to take you out of yourself and bring you to the heart. I came to show you the beauty you never knew you had and to lift you up like a prayer to the sky. Look at that. This was a Mevlevi, founder of the Mevlevi order, the Sufi master. See how this seems like an invitation to the inner dwelling. This is fraternity. This is universality. It's realizing that the divine light shines with multiple rays in every direction, wherever there is a single being who can receive it. And now is the time for us to realize this. Continuing with Saint Teresa. I believe that, when His Majesty does this, He makes Himself felt within us. It's for people who are already letting go of worldly things, because He calls them specifically to be attentive to inner matters. Wow, this passage is really beautiful, guys. This passage and all its context. She says that those beings who hear this call, who are called to this more intimate contact with God, are not, generally speaking, just anyone. They are chosen. But why are they chosen? They are chosen by God from among those who are letting go of any attachment to worldly things. When the world seems dull to them, when the only action that matters is surrender, when they no longer have many ties to any kind of desire or possession, things that are valued by so many, these already seem superfluous to them. This lack of interest in illusory possessions causes them to start gravitating toward true possessions and brings them closer to the vision of the divine. It's very interesting that she will talk about this soon, about how these beings are the ones who are most at risk. At risk because, as their voice reflects a deeper voice, something of the divine voice, through their voice, many can awaken and see. She will talk about the danger that this creates. Later on, she will return to the topic of thought. The third thing is that, even with the care taken not to think, perhaps nothing will awaken thought to think too much. She will say, "Look, I talked to several learned people who, in fact, I later found out were only somewhat learned, not truly learned, who said that before you begin to pray, you should control your thoughts. I tried every way, and it doesn't work. You go into prayer with your thoughts making noise just the same. The deeper you go into the core of prayer, the more those thoughts become peripheral, confused, and not so attractive anymore. Until you go even deeper into your heart, and then they dissipate. But you shouldn't wait to master your thoughts before entering the core of prayer. Each time, they become more peripheral, more confused, sometimes just more noise, and have less and less influence over the core of the human soul. Now she's going to talk about this here. If His Majesty hasn't begun to immerse us, I really can't understand how one could restrain their thoughts in a way that does more good than harm. When His Majesty wants the thoughts to stop, He occupies them in another way and gives the mind a light so far beyond what we can reach that it makes everything else seem absurd. In other words, when your approach is close enough, that thought is neutralized, illuminating what is essential. That is, this is already there, in the seventh dwelling. Don't fight with your thoughts. Let them keep chattering away. Stay in that center. Connect yourself. Develop a relationship with that center. Like that castaway I talk about, who has a rope that ties him to solid ground. And he pulls himself in, without hurry and without stopping. And little by little, you hear less and less of the roaring waves of the ocean and the storm, as you get closer to solid ground. But don't think you'll overcome it first, the roar of the waves, and only then grab the rope. It won't work. Try to shorten the flow of your understanding, but don't cut it off, nor your thoughts. But yes, it's good to remember that you are before God and who this God is. In other words, try to shorten, to summarize your understanding, your thoughts to what is essential. Don't get lost in useless wanderings. But one thing that helps, instead of repressing it, is to remember that you are before God and who this God is. I recall that some recommendations from the Tariqas, the Sufi schools, said you should imagine a divine being within your thoughts, in the midst of your thoughts. Just knowing of the presence of this divine being, the shadows tend to move away, because light and shadow cannot exist in the same space. It says, remember that you are before God. And who is this? God? Not merely a theoretical figure. Who is this? God? It's no wonder that Helena Blavatsky said that before we wake up in the morning, we should have a thought directed toward God, so that He doesn't become just an allegorical figure, one we can't explain, with whom we have no contact at all. Of course, no explanation will ever be complete. God, but there must be some contact that suggests His presence to us, because it is a powerful light to banish shadows. Continuing, in this way, one clearly understands an expansion, a widening of the soul. It's as if the water flowing from a spring had nowhere to go, but the spring itself was something that, the more water flowed, the larger it became. This seems to be what happens in this prayer, and many other wonders that God works in the soul, enabling it and preparing it so that everything can fit within it. In other words, when it begins to draw near to this divine spring, it widens the spring of our heart so that everything can fit inside it. When I tell you a bit about what love was, for example, to the medieval alchemists, who said it was the alkahest, the universal solvent, that you offered the cup and God would fill it, but if it was genuine, it would dissolve. This cup would spread out in all directions, because love cannot find limits. If you truly love, It has to extend. Your heart has to be able to hold all of humanity, all of nature, everything that is worthy of being loved. In other words, the cosmos has to fit inside your heart. And for that, only the divine can make it wide enough. This source that flows, runs within your heart, keeps expanding this. Capacity to contain, to hold, to make space, to give. Outlet, that's the word I was looking for, to give outlet to this divine source. And by expanding this heart, one day everyone will fit inside it. I know there is much to fear in this case, from those who listen and abandon this voice. See, this is the passage I was referring to. The man who has some contact with the divine, some inspiration, some perception, some inclination toward the sacred, some perception of a vertical path. Who has heard this voice, even if it was back in the first dwellings? She will talk about how fearful this situation is, and we will explain why. I know there is much to fear in this case, from those who hear and abandon this voice. And I know some people who bring me a lot of sorrow. And I have seen what I am talking about. Because they have separated themselves from the one who, with so much love, wanted to be their friend, and to show it through actions. And so, I strongly warn not to put yourself in such situations, because the devil does much more for a soul like this than for many, many others, to whom the Lord has not granted such favors. For they can do great harm by leading others with them, and perhaps bring great benefit to the Church of God. And even if there is nothing else, just seeing that His Majesty shows them special love, this alone is enough for the devil to go to great lengths to make them lost. And so they are greatly attacked. Setting aside religious connections and the idea of the devil, I won't get into those details. I'm a philosopher, but what she presents here is very interesting. Those who already have some mysticism, who in some way, even in a small way, have lent their voice so that sacred things can reach the world, when these people lose themselves, they fall much more deeply, with a much greater level of pain than others, when they fall into banality. Do you know why? Because what they had was a lot. Someone who loses without having anything, the pain isn't as great, the confusion isn't as overwhelming. Who loses? When you lose having so much, the confusion is much greater. The one who lends their voice so that the sacred can reach the world, the one who is like a bamboo pipe through which the breath of the Spirit arrives on earth without obstruction, when that contact is broken, the loss is immense. Do you know why? Because many receive that breath through him. So, he doesn't fall alone, he falls, taking many with him, who needed him to receive that breath, who needed him to perceive that voice, because they couldn't perceive it on their own. So, the loss is very great. That's why it's said that the tensions, the trials of the world, are much heavier for these people. Because if they are lost, a lot is lost, for them and for the world. In other words, these are always the most challenged souls, those who go through the most, who face the most envy, the greatest difficulties, because they also have the greatest responsibility. It's like imagining someone carrying a great treasure. They're the ones who attract the most thieves along the way. They are channels. These are pontiffs between heaven and earth, even if they're small, but a bit of the divine voice flows through them. They are already channels. They already make a bridge. Here, already at the end of the seventh dwelling, she says something very interesting. Because if we haven't seen, if we don't have this contact, this perception of God, how can we be certain? I don't know that. These are His works, but I know that I speak the truth. And whoever does not have this certainty, I would not say that it is the union of the whole soul with God. I don't know if you realize the depth of this little, simple sentence. A contact with something greater than multiplicity, greater than the illusion of time, space, of differentiation. A contact with unity. It means that you have seen and you see. It's an evidence against which no insecurity can stand. It's the same as if I told you, if you jump into a pool, you will sink, because everything that's heavy sinks in water. You might believe me if you've never jumped into a pool, but if you have jumped in and managed to float and swim, you'll say, "You're crazy." Of course, it's not like that. I've lived it. That's how it is when people come to others and say, "Look, there's nothing else. Life is just physical survival, just enjoyment, just surviving with comfort and pleasure. Life is simply what you enjoy. Carpe diem." If you have no experience that life is about adding value and not taking advantage of nature, that life is measured by how much you give and not by how much you keep. If you haven't lived this, you don't have the strength to oppose it. It's not because you heard someone say it. That doesn't work in these moments. When the wind blows hard, only those trees with the deepest roots, that are flexible but have deep roots, are able to withstand it. And the deepest root is evidence. And the evidence is, I have lived it. I am certain that there is a greater cause for which it's worth living. That life is not just about survival, that human life is about adding value to the world and to ourselves, and making sure we leave here greater than when we arrived. To serve something greater, to serve the great purpose of life, which is to lead all beings toward unity. And only this evidence protects us from the turbulence of the world. Many times we think we're protected because someone said something and we believed it. We believe up until the point when the wind blows hard. When the wind blows hard, someone else's opinion isn't enough to hold us up. Evidence, certainty, the contact of consciousness with being. A deep identity that connects you, even a little, with the mystery of the universe. Contact with God, as Saint Teresa used to say. Well, that's our little chat. As I told you, time is short, and we've even gone past our usual 1 hour. I wanted to bring you so much more, because this is a beautiful book, with such deep mysticism that now I understand her vision when she says her heart became pure fire. That's exactly it. Her heart is such a lasting fire that it's capable of igniting other hearts, of those who are willing to make contact with humility and a pure heart. This fire is contagious, even after so many centuries. It is one of humanity's great treasures. She was a woman who lived during the Counter-Reformation, inside her cloister, in deep prayer, and who is able to prove to us. This contact is possible. This certainty is possible, the kind that makes all our foundation of support rest in heaven. So we don't need to fear the ground so much when it shakes. Because even if the ground shakes, our foundation of support is above. The more a person has an inner life, the better they know how to respond to the outside world in an appropriate and humane way, and to open a path for themselves and for others who will come, so that they can face all difficulties, reach the other side, without betraying themselves, without betraying their human condition, and contributing to a cause that is much greater than just your own personal existence. I would like to end our talk today with a piece that you can find on YouTube. There is an ecumenical group based in France called the Thais Group, and they are composers of wonderful, very beautiful chants. And they have a chant based on a poem by Teresa of Ávila, "Let nothing disturb you, let nothing frighten you." And I would like to share this chant with you, which is a prayer, and for me, it conveys a bit. They managed to create a song that conveys a bit of the warmth of this woman's heart. It's a very beautiful video, And so I would like to end our talk today by offering you this video. Not deterred by the group TZ,